I am thrilled to have 4 amazing guests here to kick us off for our very first panel, where we are talking about how scientific uncertainty shapes decisions and policy. Our moderator today is Caitlyn Kim, who is our public affairs reporter for Colorado Public Radio. She's going to be talking and interviewing our panel of guests here for the next about 50 minutes. We have Christie Aschwanden, a journalist, an author, an editor. She's even got a new podcast she's working on that's not quite available, but really focused on science and uncertainty. We also have Nidhi Kalra, who's a senior information scientist for RAND Corporation. She has a really strong focus on the decision-making under deep uncertainty. A big fan and following some of her work for a while now. And we have Dr. Sarah Kapnick, who is the chief scientist for NOAA, our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I think probably most of us on this call know what NOAA is and who they are and what they do, but they pretty much touch anything between science and society here on our planet, but also beyond. So I'm thrilled for the wide-ranging conversation we're going to have today. Thank you to our guests for being here, and thanks to our audience for listening in. I'm going to bow out and top this over to Caitlyn Kim. Have a great talk.
Hi, thank you, everyone. Thank you all for being here, Christie, Dr. Kalra, Dr. Kapnick. I'm very excited for this conversation. That's one thing I'm not uncertain about. But let's just sort of kick it off pretty broadly about how uncertainty affects decision making. I believe Pliny the Elder supposedly had said, "The only certainty is that nothing is certain." So given that uncertainty is sort of baked into life, I'm curious, Dr. Kalra, we're going to start with you because you're in my top corner. How do you see uncertainty affecting how people make decisions?
Well, in everyday life, I mean, we can't walk out the door without acknowledging that there's some uncertainty about what happens on the other side. A lot of it is working through what we expect to happen in our everyday lives. Most things are uncertain, but within our imagination. But in science, things get a little bit different. There's real uncertainty in all kinds of scientific studies. There's really nothing that is known for certain in a scientific study. But a lot of times uncertainty is used to stop us from taking actions we need to do. It's a convenient way to say, well, I don't know, so I'm not going to do it. I don't know if the gym is really going to help me, so I'm not going to do it. Or I don't know if, having a particular carbon policy is really going to work, so I'm not going to do it. It can be both something we need to grapple with and something that provides an excuse for making some hard choices. So uncertainty is everywhere, and it's in the eye of the beholder what it really means. There's a lot of ways we operate in our lives where we say there's uncertainty, but I actually know what I'm going to do. I know what needs to be done. And some of our public policy challenges, we do that. A lot of times we don't.
Christie, I'm kind of curious. What does uncertainty mean to you?
Sorry, I'm having trouble unmuting. Well, it means a lot of things. I'll just follow up on what Nidhi said. I mean, I think we have seen historically that uncertainty is very often used as a weapon. It's sort of been weaponized against science, where vested interests have a preference for a policy, and so they use uncertainty in order to encourage inaction. The tobacco industry, I guess, really pioneered this sort of approach. I mean, they actually said doubt is our product, right? And so they tried to undermine, so the idea here is that you can never be certain enough, and we don't really know. And so we really shouldn't take action because we don't know enough. And I think for me as a journalist, one thing I've been really trying to do, and maybe even a little bit on a crusade here, to try and help the public have a better understanding of the role of uncertainty in science. I think that the general public tends to misunderstand what science is. Science is a process. It's a process of uncertainty reduction. It is not, something that creates complete certainty. But when people believe that science is certain, what it does is it shows anyone who wants to undermine something can just say, oh, look, there's some uncertainty there. Well, if you understand that that is part of the scientific process and that no result is ever final, a scientific mindset means you're always open to new evidence. There's always going to be some lasting uncertainty in everything that we know. And so I think the public really needs to have a better understanding of this, because, to not understand that uncertainty is sort of baked into science is to really be vulnerable to misinformation. And I think we've seen that a lot in the pandemic. I spent the first 2 years of the pandemic writing about COVID, and the public really got sort of a front row seat to see how science is working and how scientists were working to understand this new disease. And there was a lot that wasn't known at first. And, but through the process of doing science, we became more certain about some things and less certain of others. And that's sort of how things work and are supposed to work. And science is self-correcting, or it should be. And I think this is something I wish the public could understand better.
Well, you bring up a good point. Like, I think one of the things we all heard during the pandemic was follow the science, follow the science. But when there is uncertainty, it's sort of hard to follow the science. So, Dr. Kapnick, how about you? Oh, sorry.
I just want to really quickly say something about that. I really hate that phrase, follow the science, because I think it's a huge misunderstanding of what science is. Science does not tell you what to do. Science can inform policy. And I think that there's a very important line that needs to be understood between science and policy. And policy involves value judgments. It involves, risk assessment and things like that. So science can tell you, if you do this, this thing will happen, or this is the result of that, but it can't tell you what to do. Those are human value judgments. And that's why policy could never be entirely based on science alone.
It's a very good point. We'll get to that in a minute, but I wanted to give Dr. Kapnick a chance to sort of, I'd like to get her take on the idea of how the role uncertainty plays in the scientific process, and how do you see it playing out?
Yeah, following up from what Christie was saying, really this evolution of science, and the science can evolve, and there's quantification of information, but then how it gets used for its impacts, for its policy, for people's response, there are human and social elements to that. That is not the pure necessarily physical science or biological science or chemical science that's being applied. And I think an example of this that we use every day in NOAA around communicating information, a weather forecast. So a weather forecast actually is something that is done probabilistically. And sometimes when I say probabilistically with a group that includes journalists, their heads spin and they think that's too complicated, let's not talk about it, but it's a really simple, it's actually a really important concept of uncertainty. So when we put out a weather forecast, there's actually many different potential outcomes. And so all those potential outcomes together form the weather forecast. So you may hear there's a 30% chance of rain. That's looking at all the different scenarios of the future that are put out. But there may actually be a range in there of how much rain falls. Is it heavy? Is it light? Is it going to be a fully dry day? Might there be a little sprinkling? And so there's a range of outcomes. And in the communication of it, we try and put a lot of communication around average or one single number. But often in our ranges of forecasts and expectations in the future, there's a range of outcomes. And the communication of that is really difficult because you need to make sure people get the basic information they need and they don't get bogged down in all the understanding of the uncertainty and the problems of uncertainty. And so that becomes a communication and a social problem of how do you communicate that basic information that you have, and how do you communicate the uncertainty so people can use that information the way they need to use that. So even with a weather forecast, there's a lot of social science, particularly around weather warnings for tornadoes or hurricanes, of how do you properly communicate what is going to happen and all that uncertainty. And the social science comes in, and the policy decisions around how do you communicate that effectively to make sure that people get out of harm's way.
Well, all of you have mentioned sort of the policy, so why don't we jump into how sort of uncertainty, how science all play into decision making and then affecting policy. Nidhi, you had sort of brought up this idea that, I don't know what's going to happen, so I'm not going to do anything. And it's this idea of sometimes uncertainty leads to policy being more reactive than proactive. And I'm kind of curious, how do you all see uncertainty affecting decision making, and what values are brought to the forefront in that?
Well, uncertainty, there's the reality of uncertainty, and then there's what people do with it. So left unchecked, uncertainty is a good way for people to do nothing, or more generally, uncertainty is a way for people to engage in motivated reasoning, which is where they go, I know that I want this outcome. I want this result. And so I'm going to back into it using a bunch of assumptions that fall within the range of uncertainty. And so when left, again, unchecked, uncertainty can really invite us to engage in those cognitive biases that make good decision making almost impossible, because we all get to pick whatever predictions we want that will lead to the outcome we already prefer. And so uncertainty becomes, it looks like we're working this way from, logic and facts towards a conclusion, but really we've already arrived at the conclusion, and we find those facts that would support the thing we already believe. It doesn't have to be that way, actually. Uncertainty isn't just fiction, it's real, and we have to make good decisions amid uncertainty. But I'll pause there. We can get to how we do that. But the biggest way I see it is that motivated reasoning. We fall into all kinds of cognitive traps when we don't have better processes to think about what uncertainty really means.
I mean, to me, it sounds like you talked about backing into it, but it also sounds like sometimes, and I've seen this here on Capitol Hill, that it's also sort of cherry picking like data and science. So Dr. Kapnick, I'm kind of curious about what you think about that, how science is used, maybe sometimes abused, to get to a policy point that some lawmakers want.
A comment that was just made was around also like not making a decision, as sometimes it's used to not make a decision. I would flip it on its head, that the choice not to make a decision is still a decision. And we talk a lot about that within NOAA, that we have this information and we can make a decision based on it. And choosing not to make a decision on that, that is still a decision that needs to be made and needs to be said. And often when people are not making a decision around information that they have, they're not fully thinking about the fact that also not making that decision is still actually a decision with ramifications down the line. And so we try to have discussions around that of, we have information about the future. Sometimes we have a lot of information about the future that gives us a direction. And with that information that's directional, even if there's uncertainty around that direction, we can still make decisions around that, and we can still plan for that directional the direction that we're going in. And so a lot of discussions for us relate to that, because there's a lot of uncertainty. And as I said, these probabilistic estimates of future outcomes, which eyes glaze over if we talk too much about that. And so often we're discussing about what direction are we headed in and how can we make decisions for that direction.
Sure, there are no glazed eyes here or anywhere in this virtual panel. So Christie, though, I know you have also written a lot about this idea that, there is no sound science, and that how science is sometimes used and or abused. I'd love to get your take on that when it comes to, to getting toward the policy end of things.
Sure. I think one thing that I've seen a lot is that, we think of science as being this pursuit of truth. It's something we use. It's the most powerful tool that we have for understanding the world, right? And that's correct. But what we see is when policy is being made, and scientific controversies in general, what ends up happening is science is not being used as a tool for understanding. It's being used as sort of a tool for, litigating my side. And so people are not acting like scientists. They're not having open minds and trying to really understand what's happening. They're using, they're sort of approaching it more like lawyers trying to argue for their case. And so science becomes not something that's, a way to show what's really going on, but it becomes tools in order to advocate for your case. And so this is the sort of cherry picking that I think you were referring to earlier. So what we see here is that more science can actually, and more results can actually make these controversies worse, because all it does is it provides more fuel and more, things for people to use to sort of argue their case, because they're not, again, they're trying to, I think Nidhi really did a good job of explaining this earlier. You've made a decision, you have a preferred outcome. And so the science is just being used as a way to justify that and to make those preferences feel bona fide. And I think what we see, this goes back to the idea of following the science, is that very often the values that are underlying these preferences aren't the things that we're discussing. And so it's framed as some sort of scientific controversy or scientific discussion. Well, what's really going on, and the differences between the various sides or the various parties, are not about the science or the facts. It's about these values. And it's about, what risks are you willing to take and which risks aren't you willing to take? And I think, when it comes to debating public policy and discussing these things, it really does a lot of good to really try to surface those values, bring them to the forefront, and discuss them, so that we're not pretending that this is about science.
Can I add to that real
quick?
quick?
Yeah, go for it.
I think a great way we see exactly what you're talking about, Christie, is the difference in how decisions are med around public policy and how decisions are made for an individual's health treatment. Like if I get a diagnosis of possible, there's something cancerous going on, there's tremendous uncertainty from the first step in what are we looking at, what are we dealing with, what treatments will work. So we already grapple with scientific uncertainty in decision making, but because there's usually not too great of a value difference between a person and their doctor, or that individual's values are what drive the day, then we can use uncertainty to advance, in that case, medical policy or medical decision making. We have to manage it. And that's where we can see what uncertainty can look like when it's not this a contentious hot button, value or moral or, an issue. And uncertainty looks completely different when we start talking about shared outcomes, different values. And so we already have experience managing uncertainty and using science the way that, more in the way that we imagine in, again, a medical setting. And then we can contrast that. Well, how do we deal with uncertainty in a policy setting? And why is it so different? And does it have to do with the science or really about how humans operate?
Sarah, Dr. Kapnick, do you want to chime in?
Yeah. We see that also in terms of decision-making in communities around climate resilience and adaptation needs. And so if there's money that's coming in and there's a decision of how to spend that money on different issues, there's these long-range climate adaptation and resilience problems and probabilities and expectations, but there may also be really immediate problems of people being unhoused or food security. And when we go into communities to help with their climate adaptation and resilience plans, working with them, we often find that we have to combine these different issues so you can make solutions that deal with some of those short-term problems, but then also build the resilience to financial resilience, food security resilience, climate resilience, all into these packaged ideas of how they should make those plans going forward, because they have to deal with their immediate needs, but they also have these long-range problems that they're also dealing with. And often those competing interests of the long-term issues versus the shorter-term issues, the shorter term always wins out, and you don't make those plans for the longer-term issues at hand.
I think that's also part of just the idea of the investment, right? Like longer term requires more investment, requires more thinking, more maybe sacrifices now on the short end versus the long end, right? Like the ounce of prevention now is worth a pound of cure later down the road. So I'm kind of curious. You've all mentioned sort of the idea of values and the role values plays when it comes to sort of undertaking how they deal with uncertainty and which information they sort of focus on more. And I am kind of curious, when it comes to sort of decision making, where do you like values? What other things that we are not maybe thinking of now do you think work with uncertainty or against uncertainty to help people sort of in their minds decide this is the policy I want to lean towards, or this is what the science is telling me I should lean towards? We've talked a lot about uncertainty, but what are the other factors that you think play into this that shape decision making?
I can speak to that a little bit. I think the process by which we make decisions is tremendous. So the traditional way in which we say we're making a decision is we look at the evidence and say, well, what's going to happen in the future? Then we say, well, what's the best thing we could do? And then, maybe in technical terms, there's a sensitivity analysis, like, what if that didn't quite work out? A different way to do what that does is that encourages those cognitive biases, because we start by going, okay, what do I want to believe so that my decision gets advocated or advanced? A different way is to say, we're not going to decide what is going to happen right now. We're actually going to take all of these different values and all of our different choices and figure out how all the choices map against all the values and outcomes, and find out which decisions are robust. That means they meet a lot of goals across a large range of future possibilities without deciding which one is going to be true, and hopefully are ones that are also no regret, meaning if the future were really different, we would still think it's a good idea. Electricity for transportation is an example of that. Deploying charging stations, for instance, and encouraging the adoption of electric vehicles can be thought of as a no regret or a low regret option, because it provides us, for example, with clean air quieter, noise pollution, air pollution is reduced. There's so many benefits of going towards electric that even if we weren't only trying to solve climate change, this might be the way of the future. So there's a lot of decisions that are actually like that are hard to see when we're really focused on being right rather than finding a robust solution.
Yeah, and I can maybe weigh in here a little bit about, I think there's a lot of human psychology at play here too. We're very risk averse, and people tend to look at risks differently if they're gaining versus losing something. So you can take sort of the same probability, and if I feel like I'm going, that's the chance I'm going to lose something, will feel different than if that's the chance of gaining something. I mean, this is why people play the lottery, right? Like your chances are very, very low, but the payoff's high. But I've written quite a lot about shared decision making in medicine. So this is another example where you have a great deal of uncertainty. And so, for instance, you may have someone with cancer who faces, some treatment options, and there may be a situation where most of them have very low chance of success, and maybe very high, side effects, and the consequences of the treatment may be pretty dire, and they might not be things people would normally choose to do. But what you'll find is that oftentimes some people will say, well, I have to do everything. I just wouldn't want to feel like I'd left some treatment untried. And, these are the value judgments. There's going to be another person in that situation who will say, forget it. I know that this cancer is incurable. I have a very low chance of surviving this. And so I want to make my quality of life the best that it can be right now. But these are the value judgments, and they can be really tricky. And I think when you're looking at life and death situations like this, it really surfaces those values, and it makes it challenging, and it can be very challenging for physicians. And it's interesting, there tend to be sort of different patient personality types. There are some patients who say, I want to know everything, and I want to make my decision, and I want it to be very much based on my values. But there are other patients who say, no, I want a doctor to tell me what to do. I don't want to be the one to decide, because this is scary and I'm not the expert. And those are individual differences that I think in medicine we can honor that. But when you're looking at that sort of situation on a bigger, society-wide basis, I think it becomes much more complicated.
That it does. And I like that phrase you used, or the idea that you used, of shared decision making, because that is essentially what policy is. You have all these different people coming together to find a way forward. And Dr. Kapnick, I think, your idea of your example of climate resiliency, I think, is also a really good example of that kind of shared decision making and value judgments, right? Like some lawmakers might value jobs that energy industry or the oil and natural gas industry brings to their district, whereas others might value sort of prioritize the health concerns, impacts in communities within that. I'm kind of curious what you think about the idea of values and this, and how it plays into sort of shared decision making.
Yeah,
policy.
Seeing the how our science and how our communication is used, it really, usually the decisions relate to life and loss of life, its costs, the economic costs of things, and decisions that are made or not made. The livelihoods or jobs, the effects of jobs for people, but also just the way that the jobs still operate. Maybe they continue, but they've changed fundamentally in some way. Then it's future impacts. What are the future impacts as you look down the line? Kind of do a chess game of how your decision has ramifications as it continues. And then also, how do future decisions lead to, or how do decisions that you make now lead to future new decisions and creation of precedents or ways of making decisions, kind of like an anchoring. If you make one decision now, or you put some certain types of information now, does that then anchor your people to think that there are certain solutions always to that problem? And we see this in a number of areas that we're working in, about how certain information or decision early on can then lead to a precedent. So, for example, when the first forecast comes out of an extreme weather event, people anchor to that forecast, and then they expect that outcome, and they don't necessarily listen to the updates. And so when that comes out, and the guidance from that is really important to make sure people respond if they then are in harm's way and the forecast changes over time.
I'm curious, sorry. Nidhi, did you want to chime in?
what we've painted, I think, is a picture of how like the human mind grapples or often fails to grapple with uncertainty, especially when we're in a group. And I want to go back to something Christie said earlier, which is that simultaneously there are some powerful interests, unnamed powerful interests, that are wanting to exploit that Achilles heel in the human mind. And there's this great book called Merchants of Doubt that is, I don't know, maybe 10 years old now, 10, 15 years. And it's fantastic. It lays out how this idea of using doubt, how essentially vested interests will use doubt as a way to exploit our weaknesses in collective decision making, and it's very intentional. And so it's not only that we as a society are trying to make decisions amid complicated scientific information and different values, but that just as an advertisement on a billboard is designed to very quietly manipulate what I understand about a problem, so too is doubt deployed in this way. So I don't mean to be negative, but boy, there's also times it feels like an adversarial game. It's not just a hard problem.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that to say there's this really fascinating science historian at Stanford named Robert Proctor, who has dubbed sort of a name for this called agnogenesis, which is basically the intentional manufacture of ignorance. And so this isn't just like simple unknowing, it's really a lack of comprehension that's been deliberately created by agents who don't want you to know. And this is something, the tobacco industry really pioneered, but there are many other examples. We've seen it with climate, where there are, there's this sort of whipping up of doubt, this using doubt as a weapon against science. And I think that it's a really interesting concept to think about. And we see a lot of examples.
I'm curious, and this is more of like a philosophical question. We are talking about uncertainty. Uncertainty and doubt, are they the same thing in your minds, or are they very different?
I think uncertainty is the external phenomenon. It's the fact, and doubt is how we experience it often.
Okay. Well, I'm going to stay on the example of climate change, because I feel like this is a very good example for what we're talking about with uncertainty, short-term versus long-term actions, and how doubt or uncertainty is sometimes used to hinder or try and push policy forward. And I think the example that I'd use is what I've seen here. On some levels, Congress has worked in a bipartisan manner to make investments into climate resiliency, climate change, but they've also done bipartisan or partisan legislation to do this. And I've always found it fascinating that, some lawmakers, I think in the scientific community, there is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, there is a vast majority of scientists believe that climate change is happening, that mankind is contributing to it, and that it is something that needs to be dealt with. But you don't necessarily see that kind, and I think you all see that in public polling, but you don't see that kind of urgency in Congress. And I think a lot of that comes from what people would use, like sometimes will point to data and say, we don't necessarily need to do anything now. And I'm kind of curious, how do you see that argument playing out in Congress when it comes to climate change policy?
I would say generally right now that conversation is changing a bit from you can just look at it in the future. And that's because of so many events in the last few years that have been unprecedented events is changing the conversation, because there was a lot of thought that climate change impacts and extremes were something that would happen far off into the future and would be attributable to climate change. That is an area of research that I was championing over the last 10 years. And it came out in the most recent IPCC report on how you can actually quantify changes in extreme event probabilities and how they're increasing now, and they're actually detectable now, whereas there used to be in previous reports and in previous science, like they'll be detectable in the future. They will detect changes in probabilities, but they're actually detectable right now. And here in the United States last summer, there was an unprecedented heat wave in the Pacific Northwest that was not in our observational record and was so far outside the realm of normal variability that it was deemed one that was improbable, if not impossible, due to climate change. So you couldn't get it in the observed record, and even our climate models didn't have it for a few decades more. as something that would emerge. And so these events that are so extreme, the risks of those events, the probability is growing so much, that has led to some public awareness around these risks not being something about the future, but being now. And heat waves are an example that I use a lot because they actually, in developed nations, they're the largest killer of people. They're a silent killer, but it's the exposure, they kill at a much higher rate than other extremes. And they also lead to infrastructure damage of buckling streets. They lead to melting of asphalt that wasn't built to certain standards. They lead to downed wires and power outages. And so they have some real physical manifestations that people also see.
Yeah, and I think, we're at a point where you can no longer deny that this is happening. And so there's kind of a changing of the types of denial. But I just want to point out that, there is a lot of uncertainty in climate change, but the uncertainty is not whether it's happening. But what's used is, these doubt makers say, well, we don't really know. Well, there's a lot of things we really do know. And I think it's important for people to understand that even in the face of uncertainty, we can know things. We still don't understand quantum mechanics, right? All of the details of that. And yet we're able to make machines and do things, and, airplanes don't fall out of the sky. So, uncertainty doesn't mean not knowing. And I think what we've seen with climate is that, the tenor of the conversations have really changed over the years. I mean, you can go on YouTube and find this. Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich actually did an ad together, I believe it was in the 90s, about climate change and how we needed to act. This was not always this hyper-partisan issue that it has become. And so, what you can really see here is that this isn't a scientific debate. It's not even necessarily a policy debate. It's more of become this sort of identity politics sort of thing, which is really dangerous.
I'll add that there's a difference between Congress and the rest of the country. And there's this great, I was actually just looking for it, this great study done out of Princeton, again, also maybe 10 years ago, which looked at how, to what extent does American support for a policy increase its likelihood to be implemented? And for the 80% of regular Americans, it doesn't matter whether we hate it or love it, Congress is going to do what Congress is going to do. And who is Congress responding to? It's actually responding to a much smaller constituency, about the 20% who actually have access and influence. So until really those 20% perhaps start caring about climate change, Congress may not. So it's not really representative, even though it's a representative democracy. So it's a different country in a way, all to itself.
Can I add that to the previous conversation that we had about all the impacts that things can have, there's also been a shift. There's been a shift in the decision making around climate being something about future physical manifestations and the science side, and it's very abstract of what that means. And now with the extremes and with examples, people are also seeing a major thing that they're responding to is the costs of those impacts, the financial costs of inaction, particularly around adaptation and resilience. We're seeing that with physical assets, with damages, and we're also seeing it with changes in insurance policies and loss of insurance policies in markets like California and Louisiana and Florida post wildfires and extreme rains and flooding events. And so those costs are then having ramifications that require decisions to be made in those spaces.
I would actually add, I think that is probably one of the biggest drivers for why people lawmakers in Congress do act, because the cost for dealing with the flooding, like dealing with FEMA money for flooding, for wildfires, has just gotten so large that it's more beneficial financially for the government to deal with it now, or at least to start resiliency stuff now, rather than deal with the outcomes of after some sort of extreme event. But this conversation actually leads to an interesting segue, an audience question that we have, or a comment. And, we talked about values, but when it comes to the policy realm, it's not necessarily value. Sometimes it's ideology that comes into play, political ideology. And the audience member was kind of curious how you guys see this difference between values and ideology. Do you see a difference? Do you not? All right, Christie, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Right.
As a former journalist or as a journalist.
Yeah. I think there is a nuance here. So values are sort of, the underlying, these are things like, I value truth. I value, the things that you hold dear. And ideology is sort of a framework that is built on those, ideally, although that's not always the case, right? I mean, we've seen ideologies that have risen now that may not always capture people's values, but I think the ideology is sort of a framework of belief systems of, what should be done in policy that should be ideally based on values. But I'm curious to hear what the other panelists think.
All right, Nidhi, there you go.
I really I struggle with that, partly because it's not my area of research, and I want to say I think one person's values become another person's ideology, maybe when they disagree. So it might also, a little bit of it I think is in the eye of the beholder, whether it is a value or an ideology. But I'll stay in my lane.
Dr. Kapnick, I know you probably also have to have as a government employee.
I would say my job is to help people understand the science that we have and understand what the future outcomes can be and what those ramifications be, and then help them understand what that means for whatever decision tree they want to make, what all those different pieces mean.
I'm curious, we've talked a lot about sort of how uncertainty plays a role in sometimes not making decisions or dragging your feet when it comes to decisions. How do you think about removing those kind of barriers to taking action when it comes to uncertainty? Are there certain things that can be done? Are there certain ways, evidence that scientists like yourselves and journalists like yourselves can focus on, not just these are just the facts, but like, how do you all try and remove those barriers to taking action that sometimes people use that they hide behind when it comes to uncertainty?
I guess I can start. As a journalist, I think one of the things I think about a lot is that facts never sway people. You really, there's this, I think it's called the information deficit idea, where you think, well, people just need more information, and if they understand the facts, they'll come around to my side. But that's not how people make decisions or choose what to believe and whatnot. And the human mind really thinks in stories. And I think that's one place where, journalism can help by putting those facts and putting that information into a narrative that people can sort of wrap their heads around, because it's really hard to just make sense of data, in a vacuum. And so I think narratives are really important. And this is something that we see a lot. So going back to shared decision-making in medicine, one of the approaches that has been tried and tested there is sort of giving people little stories and vignettes to help them understand some of the things, looking at different ways of conveying information. So instead of just having raw numbers, using charts that actually have some sort of visual element sometimes can be a more effective way for helping people to understand, the risks and benefits of a particular course of action. I wrote a story a few years ago for Washington Post about severe weather warnings. It was very interesting. There's some fascinating research about how people respond to these and the best approaches and what we've seen. And Sarah kind of touched on this earlier, but if you live in a hurricane zone and there have been 3 hurricanes that have gone through, and you've been in the evacuation zone and you didn't evacuate and nothing happens, you come to believe, well, those don't apply to me, or this isn't going to happen. And this is, that's absolutely not the correct, feeling to take away from that. And yet we have these biases towards, our previous experience. And then also looking at, well, the cost to me to evacuating is pretty high. If I don't think anything's going to happen, I'm not going to do it. Now you could flip that around and say, yeah, but the cost of not evacuating, if you're going to get hit, could be even higher. But we're sort of biased by these recent events. And so I think it's really interesting to look at, there's such a huge role for human psychology here that needs to be acknowledged.
Yeah. I find for our conversations, it's similar to what you just said. It's finding the common ground in the interests of individuals, and then making a story around explaining the facts, explaining the information. And scientists want to just give a bunch of numbers and facts and just throw them out there and then hope that they get used. And I have the saying that value of data and information is only realized if people actually start using it and using it effectively. And it's not just enough to put it out there and hope that it gets picked up. There has to be the storytelling around what things mean. You have to paint a picture so people can understand what those facts and hard numbers mean in reality, so they can fully understand it and use it. And it's a careful use of it too. With the comment, the extreme warnings, we are very careful when we want to be really, really forceful, very dangerous, very high likelihood for death. Please respond to the information we're putting out. We don't do that with every single storm, because then you have a problem of the boy who cried wolf. If people hear it so many times, if you are being too extreme with every case, then they don't listen when they really need to. And so there's a whole range of ways that we communicate based on the risks. And when we go really extreme, that is because it is the worst case scenario.
I mean, if I can add to that, it also, I think, helps to use the uncertainty to tell the story. So one of the things we do is say, okay, look, there is this uncertainty. That's the scientific reality. Let's use it to stress test each of the options on the table and find out what we use the word brittle. So a decision would be brittle if it only makes sense if your prediction was right. Like if you're right, then your decision is a great idea, but otherwise it stinks. That's a brittle decision. If a particular choice makes sense, no matter what the future brings, that makes it a robust decision. And telling stories about how strong or how robust a choice is versus how brittle it is, people can imagine things that break easily, and turning that then into a narrative. So bridging from the raw data to what it means for a decision, what picture does it paint for how this decision might turn out, given that we can't know exactly how the future will turn out, really, I think, helps people come to grips with the implications. And it also dislodges them from this idea of, oh, I can just cherry pick the facts. Because when we're like, well, let's say your cherry picked facts aren't the ones, then how bad is it? And we talk about regret, talk about missed opportunity. And that gets people feeling like, okay, my viewpoint was taken into account. You did analyze what my assumptions were across all these different options. And so I'm more likely to take in what you're saying than if you disregard my predictions as being irrelevant. So a whole lot of process can go into turning some of the uncertainty into a tool for stress testing.
Dr. Kapnick, you wanted to add.
I was going to go back to tie to what we said earlier. It becomes this robust decision. So if you make a decision that you're happy with, if you know multiple outcomes and you're happy with the outcomes, if you make that decision for all those outcomes, you're much happier about the decision, and then you're trusted more in the future. And I think that discussion around what all the outcomes are and how your different decisions will have ramifications on those outcomes allows for that to make a decision much more comfortably.
It also, I think, like this idea of like really sort of thinking out through all the different scenarios is also probably one of the things that leads to sort of more, not a slower pace, but sometimes where people don't react as quickly, right? Like sometimes decisions you have to make on the fly in the face of uncertainty, or fairly quickly, like the medical example, right? You get something, a diagnosis, the doctor says you need to start treatment in a week, versus climate policy, which can sometimes take 2 years in Congress to come through. I'm kind of curious, Dr. Kapnick, you said that, how you like to see the data used. You guys put all this data out and like you push it out there and hope that journalists like Christie and I will use it to tell a story about something. And I'm kind of curious, how do you see that partnership do you see a partnership between the data that you, like agencies like yours puts out, and how research organizations like RAND uses it, how journalists use it? Is there a lot of interaction, you think, that goes into that so that the data is used, I don't want to say correctly, but I'm going to say it correctly?
That is actually a point of one of my priorities as NOAA chief scientist, is making sure that our data is used and that we're communicating it better. I think a lot of scientists, particularly in the climate sphere, originally thought if we just put the data out there, people will respond, and they'll respond in kind, and they'll do what needs to happen, or we'll see. And we don't see people necessarily taking up the data to make the decisions that they need to make. And so there's a lot of thought into our products now of, okay, if this product or this information is put out, And we're hoping that communities will use it for building resilience, for example. In coastal communities, we put sea level rise information. If communities aren't getting that information, there's a lost opportunity to make decisions based on knowledge of the future. And so how do we do that engagement? And then we build out our engagement structure. How do we go into those communities? How do we open grants to be able to help people use the data? We find in many communities, particularly disadvantaged communities, socioeconomically less capable or less socioeconomically depleted communities, that they don't have the capacity to make those decisions with that information. So we find that we put the grant out, but then they can't apply to it. So then we also have to provide technical expertise and technical help so that they can make those decisions. And so tracking how information is getting picked up is creating a change in how we're providing our products and services to making sure people have access. And I think it's a shift in scientific communities of recognizing this need and recognizing this need for social science to be brought into the science more.
Great. We also have, staying on the climate issue, we also have another audience question. And this has to do with sort of how the insurance industry is growing more certain about climate change as an uninsurable risk. And the question is risk all about controlled uncertainty? Nidhi.
I don't think that's the characterization I would use. When the insurance industry talks about uninsurable risk means there's some, insurance wants to insure those risks that there's a small likelihood of happening. They can collect premiums from everybody. And when once in a while it does happen, they can have enough money for both a payout and to keep on keeping on. As climate becomes curiously more certain, they're like, oh, everybody is going to have to pay a whole lot of money. And we can't collect high enough premiums to cover the fact that climate is no longer a remote risk. It's a very real present risk. So they're not controlling the uncertainty. In a way, it's that the magnitude of the risk has gone up so much that now it doesn't fall into the category of things you can insure against in many cases.
I would also add that sometimes this comment of uninsurable also relates to not having enough information to price the insurance. And so that's something that we work on, and we talk to the industry around what data do we have, what knowledge do we have of the future, and how can that information be used to characterize risk over time and how that risk is evolving over time around the world. And we often hear that they need authoritative information to be able to make decisions and price that risk, because without that information, they throw up their arms and say, well, if we don't think we can price this, if we don't think we can measure it properly, then we can't provide those products. And so it's with that information that they can then do that. Now, there's a whole other question of whether that will be affordable for people that currently live in those locations who have been mispricing that risk for the entire time they've held those assets. But that is a different problem to deal with.
And not the problem for today.
Yeah.
Christie.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue it's not controlled uncertainty. It's uncertainty run rampant. The problem, what makes it uninsurable is that it's too uncertain.
It's too uncertain. But I mean, that's actually an interesting question. Is there sometimes there's some like certain uncertainty and then uncertain uncertainty? Like we have some data versus like no data to back up anything? Nidhi.
Yeah, this may be where some vocabulary that we use can be helpful. We have a phrase we use called deep uncertainty. We say deep uncertainty exists when, one, you can't assign probabilities. So once you've left the realm of being able to say there's a 10% or 20% or 5 to 15%, you're like, I don't know. We would call that deep uncertainty. And so there's a risk is what we might call quantifiable. You have actuarial tables, you have data that would support, some kind of probability density function, if I can say that. Whereas for certain other kinds of risks, especially those that are at the very tails, at the very ends, very low likelihood, but high consequence. What is it? One in 100, or 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000. That becomes very hard to think about, especially when we don't agree. So that's when we get into this realm of deep uncertainty, and where I think it's all the more important to think about robust decisions rather than decisions optimized to any particular prediction.
All righty. Anyone else?
I'll add that. So I'm a climate scientist by training. I've done research in climate science and current science world, but I have also worked in financial industry in a number of different capacities. And just information is needed to make those decisions in finance just as it is anywhere else. And a decision can be made, and it might be priced at a price that people don't want to buy it, but with information, it can still be structured. And I think that is where the communication of these uncertainties and how information is used becomes so critical, particularly in the area of insurance or other types of financial products based on climate information. Is where is the uncertainty that is driving these products not being made? And is it uncertainty, or is it also just the cost of expected future outcomes, which is making it not be structured?
Very interesting. I'm going to also go to one last audience question. And Nidhi, I'm going to throw this one to you because I feel like it's going to be in your realm. And it was, we've talked a lot about uncertainty, but there is also AI and deep learning and other advanced thinking machines and systems that impact our understanding and concerns about, or our understanding and maybe lessons or, has different percentages about sort of uncertainty, unpredictability, risk. How does that all play into it?
Right, so this speaks to, my prior hat, my training is as a roboticist, and I used to do a lot of work with these techniques. There's a way in which they can be really useful in helping us make sense of reams and reams of data that are coming out of dozens of models and hundreds of climate scenarios, and say, okay, what are the big themes that are emerging? How do we synthesize this? We use machine learning techniques all the time in our work. Because the data is just so large, the human mind can't look at it and know what's going on. But where I think we get into a problem is when we then turn to machines and say, well, what should our values be? Or what do you, or to try to tell a story about what's happening. So once we bridge that line or that gap between managing the data and running models and simulations into how do we make human sense of these, I think that's an application of AI and machine learning that I would walk back. But absolutely, we already use it to help make sense of very complex models that give us the data in the first place, and then process that data to say, what are we looking at here?
All right. We're going to have to, Dr. Kapnick, did you want to chime in on this?
Without getting too into the weeds on process, I would also say the outcomes are only as good as the data that we put into it. And so there can be issues if the data isn't sufficient to be able to use it. And I think that people are starting to grapple with that as they understand how to use these new tools.
All right. We're going to start wrapping up, but I want to end on something positive note if I can. And really quickly, just going around the Zoom, or what do you we've talked a lot about uncertainty and how it shapes decision making, and then also how it affects policy. And there are a lot of questions and hurdles to it. Is there anything that you're really hopeful about or see a solution to help people make better decisions when faced with a lot of uncertainty? Dr. Kapnick, I'm going to start with you since you're in the lower corner.
I would say that I've seen a shift in more use of information and data around some of these hard problems, and trying to recognize both the utility of the data and information, but also the social biases, the behavioral science, and psychology around all of this. And I think that it has moved towards trying to make more informed decisions holistically. That gives me hope that we will get better at decision making going forward.
Nidhi?
Hopefully it's in time. A lot of countries are putting forward their decarbonization strategies, and some of them are stress testing their decarbonization strategies or future-proofing it. What they find is that decarbonization is smart. It's not just smart because climate change is going to be rough. It's smart because it confers all these other social, economic, and environmental benefits that we're already pursuing. So I'm hopeful that actually this process of stress testing against uncertainty leads us into coalitions that support fighting climate change and adapting to climate change. And California, just a few weeks ago, put out its decarbonization plan, how to get to net zero by 2045. We worked, for example, with Costa Rica to help them find understand how their decarbonization plan yields billions of dollars in net benefits. And so using this process, people are getting on board. People are going, oh my gosh, this can not just be good for the planet. It can be good for my hometown or for my community. And I think that's galvanizing a lot of action.
Christie, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think we're seeing a lot of examples where people are making good decisions in scenarios of uncertainty. I mean, uncertainty is just a fact of life, right? It's always there. Even when we think we're certain, they're often uncertainties that we're just not acknowledging or realizing are there. I think we saw that in the pandemic. You assume that you're going to go to work the next day in the office, and all of a sudden you're not, you're stuck at home. And who would have predicted that? Well, there were people who predicted that something like this could happen. But I do think that there's a lot of really interesting and useful research now showing how people can make better decisions under uncertainty. And I think we've seen a lot of examples of how these are being used. Climate change is one, medicine is another. I think we're seeing this across an array of different topics. And so I'm hopeful, and I think as a journalist, I see my role as helping people better understand uncertainty and maybe feel a little bit less afraid of it, because I think that, the human mind hates uncertainty and will go to great lengths to try and eliminate it. But I think just learning to sort of sit with it a little bit can be a really powerful thing.
Great. I think that is a very uplifting note to end on. Sit with some uncertainty, but I certainly want to thank you all for participating in today's panel. And Kristen, I see you are back. But really quickly, again, Christie Aschwanden, journalist, podcaster. Good luck with your podcast coming up. Dr. Nidhi Kalra for joining us from RAND, and Dr. Sarah Kaplan. Kristen, over to you now.